Elias Boone rode slowly into the small town of Dry Creek, his horse's hooves kicking up little clouds of dust with each step. The sun hung high in the wide, empty sky, pouring down heat that made the wooden buildings of the town shimmer. Elias pulled on the brim of his worn hat, shading his eyes as he studied the quiet street in front of him. It was the kind of town that looked tired, as if it had been fighting battles for too long. The paint on the storefronts had faded, boards were cracked, and even the sign above the saloon swung loosely in the breeze. What struck Elias most wasn't just the poor shape of the town, but the people. A woman hurried across the street with a basket, but kept her eyes on the ground. A man outside the general store nodded to Elias quickly, then looked away as if afraid to be caught staring. Even children who should have been playing ran silently back inside as soon as they noticed the stranger. Elias had seen places like this before. He had been a drifter for years, riding from town to town, sometimes finding work, sometimes moving on. He had learned how to read fear in people's faces, and Dry Creek was full of it. Something, or someone, held this place in its grip. He guided his horse down the main street, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the steady rhythm of hooves. Elias stopped in front of a water trough, slid off his horse, and let the animal drink. As he leaned against the post, his sharp eyes caught movement near the stable. At first he thought it was just another ranch hand, but when he looked closer, his heart tightened. There, half hidden in the shadow of the stable, was a young woman. She knelt beside the pigs, her hands trembling as she scooped up scraps from the trough. The pigs snorted and shoved at her, but she barely reacted, too hungry to care. Her dress was torn and dirty, her hair tangled and her face thin from lack of food. Still, behind the dust and weariness, Elias could see she was young, perhaps no more than 20. For a long moment, Elias stood frozen. He had seen poor folks, he had seen desperate folks, but never had he seen someone brought so low that they had to share food with animals. His stomach turned at the sight, and yet what struck him most was not her shame. It was the way people walked past as if she weren't there. Two men came out of the saloon, laughing too loudly, their boots clattering on the boards. They glanced toward the woman, then looked away quickly, their laughter fading. A woman carrying a basket of bread crossed to the other side of the street to avoid passing too close. No one offered help. No one spoke. It was as though they all pretended not to see her, and in pretending, they accepted her suffering. Elias clenched his jaw. Something about the scene lit a fire in him. He was not a man who went looking for trouble, but he had never been able to walk away from injustice either. Slowly he stepped closer. The pigs scattered a little, grunting at the tall stranger who dared enter their space. The young woman looked up, startled. Her eyes, once bright, were now dull with hunger and exhaustion. Yet there was still a flicker of pride in them. She froze, half afraid that Elias had come to mock her like others surely had. She tried to straighten her back, tried to keep some dignity even though she had been caught with scraps in her hands. Elias spoke softly, his voice even and calm. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "You don't belong down there." Her lips parted as if she wanted to answer, but no words came. Instead, she dropped the handful of scraps back into the trough and tried to turn away. Elias could see her shoulders trembling. Without thinking twice, Elias reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside was the bread and dried meat he carried for his travels. He walked over slowly and held it out to her. The young woman's eyes widened. For a moment she didn't move. Then she shook her head, whispering so softly he almost didn't hear. "If they see, you'll be in trouble." Elias frowned. "Who's they?" She shook her head again, glancing nervously toward the saloon and then the sheriff's office across the street. "Please," she whispered, "just go." But Elias didn't move. He set the food gently on a nearby rail, as if leaving it for her to take when she was ready. Then he straightened up and looked around at the silent, watching street. He could feel eyes peeking from windows, could sense the weight of judgment from behind closed doors. Whoever controlled this town had taught its people to look away from suffering and to fear kindness. Elias was no stranger to fear. He had carried his own burdens, lived through his own battles. But seeing the young woman forced to eat with pigs while everyone ignored her, this was something he could not let pass. The young woman's name, as he would later learn, was Clara. In that moment, she was just a figure of quiet despair, a shadow of what she had once been. Yet Elias already knew one thing: he could not turn his back on her. He returned to his horse, giving her space, but his eyes stayed on her as she finally reached out, trembling, and snatched the bundle of food. She ate quickly, almost desperately, but when she noticed him still watching, she slowed, chewing more carefully as if to remind herself she was human, not an animal. Elias mounted his horse and rode further down the street, but inside his heart a decision was forming. He had come to Dry Creek expecting only to water his horse, maybe buy supplies, and then move on. But now he knew he would stay. Something had happened in that stable yard, something that tied him to Clara's fate. The town of Dry Creek was quiet, too quiet, but beneath the silence was a sickness. Elias had seen its face in the hungry young woman and the fearful townsfolk. He didn't yet know the name of the man who cast such a shadow here, but he had a feeling he would find out soon enough. And when he did, Elias Boone would be ready. Elias Boone did not leave Dry Creek that evening. Something inside him refused to let him ride on. Instead, he found a quiet corner in the saloon, ordered a simple meal, and kept his ears open. A drifter learns more by listening than by asking, and Elias was patient. The saloon was dim, filled with the smell of smoke and whiskey. A piano sat unused in the corner, its keys yellowed and chipped. The few men inside drank quietly, their laughter too quick, too nervous, as if they wanted to avoid drawing attention. Elias noticed how every conversation hushed the moment the door swung open, then picked up again only after the newcomer was recognized as harmless. Through fragments of talk, Elias began to piece together the story of the young woman he had seen. Her name was Clara Dawson. Once her family had been respected ranchers, their land stretching far across the hills outside of town. Folks said her father, Thomas Dawson, had been a man of honor, someone who never cheated a neighbor and always offered help when someone was in need. Her mother was remembered as gentle, teaching Clara to play the piano in church on Sundays. But both had died suddenly in a fever one harsh winter, leaving Clara to run the ranch alone. For a while she managed. People recalled her riding into town with her head held high, selling cattle at fair prices, handling the Dawson land as best as she could. But all of that changed when Sheriff Maddox stepped in. Maddox was more than just a sheriff. He was a man who used his badge to tighten control. Rumor had it that he had taken land from more than one family, always with the same trick. He would claim taxes were unpaid or that debts were owed, then send his men to collect. When people resisted, they would find themselves locked up on false charges, their property signed over to Maddox's name. No judge ever came to Dry Creek to stop him, and the townsfolk were too frightened to fight back. Clara had been his most defiant target. When Maddox showed up with his men, waving papers that said the Dawson Ranch now belonged to him, she had stood on her porch with a rifle in her hands. She told him the land was her family's and she would die before giving it up. Maddox had laughed in her face, then stepped aside as his men overpowered her. They didn't harm her, but they set fire to the barn, drove off her cattle, and left her with nothing but ashes. When Clara came into town asking for help, no one dared stand with her. Maddox warned the townsfolk that anyone who gave her food or shelter would share her fate. And so day by day, Clara's pride had been stripped away until she was left with no choice but to search for scraps, like the one Elias had seen. Listening to these stories, Elias kept his expression calm, but inside him a storm was building. He had met men like Maddox before, men who believed fear could hold power forever. But fear had its cracks, and Elias had learned long ago that all it took was one act of courage to widen those cracks until the whole wall crumbled. When Elias finished his meal, he paid the barkeep and asked quietly, "Where can I find a place to rest my horse?" The barkeep hesitated, then leaned in close. "Best you don't stay long, stranger. Maddox doesn't take kindly to men sticking their noses where they don't belong." Elias gave a small smile. "I reckon my nose belongs wherever I decide." That night, instead of sleeping, Elias walked the quiet streets of Dry Creek. He found Clara sitting on the steps outside the old church, clutching the bundle of food he had given her. She had eaten some, but she held the rest tightly as if afraid it might vanish. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wary but no longer entirely closed off. "You should go," she whispered. "They'll notice you gave me food. Maddox will come after you." Elias sat down a short distance away, careful not to crowd her. "I've dealt with men like Maddox before," he said. "He's only strong because everyone's afraid. Fear can be broken." Clara shook her head, bitterness in her voice. "No one will fight him. They've seen what happens when someone tries. My father's friends promised to stand with me, but when the time came, not one of them showed. I've lost everything. Even my name means nothing here now. Her words were sharp, but Elias could hear the hurt behind them. He studied her, seeing not just the dirt and weariness, but the spirit that still flickered beneath. Your name still means something, he said quietly. It means enough that Maddox tried to crush it. If you were nothing, he wouldn't have bothered. Clara looked at him then, really looked, as if weighing whether to believe his words. For the first time, a spark lit in her eyes, though faint. The silence of the night wrapped around them, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Elias leaned back against the church steps. You said no one will fight him. Maybe you're right. But I've never believed in walking away when I see wrong done. Why? Clara asked softly. Why do you care? You don't know me, Elias thought for a long moment. He could have told her about the towns he had passed through, the people he had seen broken under men like Maddox, the graves left behind. He could have told her about the times he had ridden away, telling himself it wasn't his fight, only to wake in the night haunted by the faces of those he had abandoned. Instead, he simply said, because no one deserves to be treated like less than human. Not while I'm around. Clara turned her face away, but Elias noticed the way her hands tightened around the cloth bundle, as though holding on to more than food, maybe holding on to hope. The next morning, Dry Creek awoke with its usual silence, but something had shifted. Elias walked openly through the street with Clara beside him, her head lowered but her steps steadier than the day before. People watched from doorways, whispering, some with pity, some with fear. Maddox's men saw too. They lingered at the saloon door, eyes narrowing as they noticed Clara walking with someone who was not afraid to be seen at her side. One of them spat in the dust and muttered, "This won't sit well with the sheriff." Elias ignored them. He walked Clara to the general store and bought her a loaf of bread, placing the coins on the counter with steady hands. The shopkeeper hesitated, glancing nervously toward the window, but when Elias's eyes met his, he accepted the money without a word. Clara held the bread close, her voice trembling as she whispered, "You shouldn't have done that. They'll come after you now." Elias adjusted his hat, his expression calm. "Then let them." In that moment, for the first time in a long while, Clara smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. And though Dry Creek still belonged to Sheriff Maddox, something new had begun. The people saw that someone dared to stand with Clara, and the shadow of fear, while still heavy, had begun to thin. Elias Boone had made his choice. He would not leave, not while Clara Dawson was treated as less than she was, not while Maddox held the town in chains. The fire of defiance had been lit, and Elias knew it would not be easily put out. The news reached Sheriff Maddox sooner than Clara had expected. His men were always watching, always listening, and it didn't take long for word to spread that the drifter who rode into town was walking openly with her, buying her food, and refusing to bow his head. By the next afternoon, Maddox himself appeared on the main street riding a big black horse that kicked up dust as he pulled to a stop. The townsfolk scattered at the sight of him. Doors slammed shut, curtains were pulled across windows, and the silence of fear fell over Dry Creek. Maddox was a tall man with broad shoulders, a thick mustache, and a voice that carried like thunder. His badge gleamed on his vest, but everyone knew it was not a badge of justice. It was a badge of power. 6 armed men rode behind him, faces rough and hard, hands resting on the butts of their guns. They spread out as Maddox dismounted, forming a wall that cut across the street. Elias Boone was standing near the blacksmith shop, his horse tied to the post. Clara was close by, her eyes wide with dread. She whispered urgently, "You should go. Please, Elias, you don't know what he's capable of." Elias adjusted his hat calmly. His eyes never left Maddox as the sheriff strode forward. "Well now," Maddox drawled, his boots crunching on the dirt. "What do we have here? A stranger feeding pigs and dressing it up as kindness? Or maybe you think you're a hero coming to rescue this poor, pitiful girl?" The laughter from his men was cruel and loud. Clara lowered her head, shame burning in her cheeks. But Elias's voice cut through the noise, steady and low. "She's not pitiful," he said. "She's been wronged. And you know it." The laughter died down. Maddox's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the only sound was the creak of leather and the distant cry of a crow. You've got a sharp tongue for a drifter, Maddox said coldly. Most men who ride through Dry Creek learn quick to keep their mouths shut. You planning on staying? Or are you smart enough to get back on that horse and ride out before you make me angry? Elias didn't flinch. I reckon your anger's not mine to fear. The townsfolk watched through cracks in their shutters. They could hardly believe what they were seeing. No one ever spoke back to Maddox. People who tried were either beaten, locked away, or run out of town. Yet here was a stranger, standing calm as stone, refusing to bend. Maddox's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, so close the dust from his boots drifted against Elias's coat. You don't know how things work here. This town belongs to me. Everything in it. The land, the cattle, even the air these people breathe. And if I say this girl is nothing more than a beggar, then that's what she is. Clara's breath caught, but Elias's gaze didn't waver. You can tell yourself that, he said, but it doesn't make it true, and it doesn't make you right. A tense silence followed. Maddox's men shifted uneasily, hands inching closer to their pistols. Elias stood with his arms relaxed, but his presence was steady, like a mountain that couldn't be moved. Maddox finally gave a harsh laugh, though there was no humor in it. Another fool with more guts than sense, he sneered. I've buried plenty like you. He turned sharply, mounting his horse in one smooth motion. His voice boomed across the street. Listen well, folks of Dry Creek. This drifter thinks he can play savior. Let's see how long he lasts before he learns what happens to men who cross Sheriff Maddox. With that, Maddox yanked the reins, and his horse reared before galloping off. His men followed, kicking up a storm of dust as they rode out of town. When the dust settled, Clara exhaled shakily. You shouldn't have done that, she whispered. You've just signed your own death warrant. Elias looked at her, his eyes calm but firm. No, what I did was remind him that he doesn't own everyone, not me. Not you. Clara wanted to believe him, but fear still gripped her heart. She had seen Maddox destroy too many lives, and yet deep inside, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a fragile thread of hope. That night, the town buzzed with whispers. In the saloon, men spoke in low voices about the showdown. Some shook their heads, saying the stranger wouldn't last the week. Others quietly admitted they felt something stir inside them when they saw him stand against Maddox. It was dangerous to even say it out loud, but they couldn't deny it. Courage was contagious. Elias spent the evening near the livery, checking his horse and gear. Clara found him there, her face drawn with worry. You don't understand, she said softly. He'll come for me now. He'll come harder than before. He'll use me to break you. Elias tied the last strap on his saddle, then looked at her. Then we'll face him together. Clara shook her head. I'm no fighter. I can't stand against men like Maddox. You already did, Elias said gently. The day you stood on your porch with that rifle, you showed more courage than most men I've known. He broke your land, but he didn't break you. That matters. For a moment, Clara's eyes shone with tears, though she quickly brushed them away. The next morning, Maddox proved Clara's fears right. His men stormed into town and dragged her from the church steps where she had been resting. People watched but did nothing, afraid of Maddox's wrath. Clara shouted and struggled, but the men overpowered her easily, throwing her into the old jailhouse. Word spread fast, and Elias was waiting when Maddox rode in with a satisfied grin. The sheriff announced loud enough for everyone to hear. This girl belongs in a cage. Anyone who tries to feed her, help her, or even speak to her will share her cell. His eyes found Elias. That includes you, stranger. Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, silent but unflinching. He didn't reach for his gun, though his hand hovered close. The people of Dry Creek watched with bated breath, wondering if blood would spill right there on the street. But Elias spoke in that same calm voice. Locking her up won't change the truth, Maddox. You can build your walls, but one day they'll come down. The sheriff's eyes darkened. He leaned forward in his saddle. Then you'd better be far away when they do, because if you're still here, I'll bury you under them. With that, Maddox wheeled his horse and rode off, his men jeering as they followed. Clara's cries echoed faintly from the jailhouse. The people of Dry Creek went back to their homes, doors shutting, windows closing. But not all of them. Some lingered, whispering about what they had just seen. Maddox's cruelty had always been a fact of life, but now there was something new to whisper about. A stranger who refused to bow. Elias remained on the street, his jaw set, his mind already working. Clara was locked away, and Maddox believed fear would keep the town silent. But Elias Boone had seen fear before, and he knew how quickly it could turn into anger if given the right spark. And in that moment, he made himself a promise. He would not let Clara rot in that cell. He would not let Maddox crush what little hope remained in Dry Creek. The fight was coming, and Elias Boone was ready to meet it. The jailhouse stood at the edge of Dry Creek, a squat stone building with iron bars on the windows and a heavy wooden door that creaked like a warning every time it opened. Clara sat on the cold floor of her cell, her arms wrapped around her knees. The air was damp, the smell of rust and dust filling her lungs. She had been locked away before, but this time felt heavier. This time Maddox was not just punishing her, he was using her as bait. She knew Elias would come. That thought both comforted and frightened her. Comforted because she trusted him more than she trusted anyone else. Frightened because Maddox wanted him to come. Maddox wanted to draw him into a trap. Across town, Elias Boone prepared in silence. He sat in the blacksmith's shed, oiling the parts of his revolver, checking each bullet with steady hands. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, fixed on the task. Around him, a few men lingered, nervous but curious. They had seen what Elias had done, how he had spoken to Maddox without fear, and something inside them stirred. One man, a ranch hand named Samuel, finally spoke. "You're going after her, aren't you?" Elias didn't look up. "She doesn't belong in there," Samuel swallowed. "Maddox's men guard the place day and night. Folks say he's expecting you." Elias slid a bullet into the chamber and clicked it shut. "Then he won't be disappointed." The men exchanged glances. Fear had held them in place for so long that even talking about defiance felt dangerous. But now, watching Elias, they felt the possibility of something else. Still, none of them dared to openly offer help. Not yet night fell. The moon rose high, casting pale light over Dry Creek. The town lay quiet, its people locked away in their homes, listening to the distant footsteps of Maddox's patrol. In the jailhouse, Clara sat awake, staring at the sliver of moonlight that slipped through the bars. She whispered a prayer, not sure who she was praying to, but hoping Elias was safe. Outside, Elias moved like a shadow. He wore dark clothes, his hat pulled low. He had studied the jail all day, watching the patrol routes, the lazy way Maddox's men leaned against the walls, drinking from their flasks and laughing too loudly. They thought fear alone would keep the town still. But fear made men careless. 2 guards stood at the door. Elias waited until their laughter drowned out the sound of his boots, then moved in quick. A swift blow from the butt of his revolver sent one man sprawling silently into the dirt. The second turned, fumbling for his weapon, but Elias's hand was faster. He pressed the barrel against the man's chest and whispered, "Drop it." The guard froze. His pistol clattered to the ground. Elias tied him quickly with rope, leaving him beside his unconscious partner. Then he slipped inside the jailhouse. The interior was dim, lit only by a single lantern that flickered on the desk. Behind the bars, Clara lifted her head, her breath catching when she saw him. "Elias," she whispered. He moved to the cell, his face calm but his eyes filled with determination. "Quiet now. We don't have much time." He pulled a small iron tool from his coat and knelt at the lock. Clara pressed close to the bars, watching as he worked. Her heart pounded. For years she had felt like a prisoner in her own town, her spirit trapped by Maddox's power. And now, as she heard the click of the lock, she felt something she thought she had lost forever. Freedom. The cell door creaked open. Elias held out his hand. "Come on." Clara stepped out, her legs unsteady. For a moment she simply stood there, breathing the air of freedom, her eyes filling with tears. Elias guided her toward the door, but just as they reached it, footsteps thundered outside. Voices shouted. The guards had been found. Elias pushed Clara toward the shadows inside the jailhouse. "Stay here," he whispered. He stepped into the doorway, his revolver drawn, his body steady as stone. 3 of Maddox's men rushed forward, guns raised. Elias fired once, the bullet striking the ground near their boots. The crack of the shot echoed through the night, startling them. "You want to test me?" Elias called, his voice low and steady. "Then step closer. But know this, you won't walk away." The men hesitated. They had expected an easy capture, not a man who stared them down without blinking. Fear flickered in their eyes, and one by one they backed away, muttering curses as they melted into the shadows. Elias lowered his gun, turning back to Clara. "We need to move now." They slipped through the alleys of Dry Creek, avoiding the main road. The night wrapped around them like a cloak, hiding them from prying eyes. Clara stumbled once, but Elias caught her, steadying her with a firm hand. "You're free now," he whispered. "Don't forget that." As they made their way toward the edge of town, lights flickered on in a few homes. Faces peered out from windows, watching in silence. For the first time, the townsfolk saw not just Clara's suffering, but her courage in walking openly beside the man who had defied Maddox. A murmur spread through the town, a murmur of possibility. When they reached the church, Clara sank onto the steps, exhausted. Elias stood watch, his eyes scanning the shadows. For a long while they were silent, listening to the wind whistle through the empty streets. Finally, Clara spoke. "Why are you doing this, Elias?" "You could have left. You could be miles away by now." Elias looked down at her, his expression soft but steady. "Because no one else would. And because I don't run from men like Maddox." Clara's eyes searched his face. She saw no fear there, only resolve. For the first time in years, she felt safe. The next morning, whispers spread across Dry Creek like wildfire. People had seen Elias free Clara. They had seen Maddox's men retreat in the face of his courage. And in those whispers, something began to change. The weight of fear that had pressed down on the town for so long began to lift, just a little. Maddox, of course, heard the news. His rage was like a storm, his voice shaking the walls of his office as he shouted at his men. "If the people think they can stand against me, then I'll crush them harder. And as for Boone, he'll regret the day he ever set foot in Dry Creek." He sent word across town there would be a showdown. No more shadows, no more whispers. Elias Boone would face Sheriff Maddox in the open, in front of the whole town. Maddox wanted to prove that no drifter, no matter how brave, could stand against him. Clara heard the news with dread, but Elias only nodded, as if he had expected it all along. "Why are you so calm?" she asked. "Because," Elias said quietly, "this was always where it was headed, and when a bully calls for a fight, sometimes the only answer is to stand tall." Clara looked at him, her fear battling against the hope rising inside her. For years she had thought no one would ever challenge Maddox, but Elias Boone had, and now the whole town would see the truth with their own eyes. The fight for Dry Creek was no longer just about Clara, or even Elias. It was about every man, woman, and child who had been forced to bow their heads. The day of reckoning was coming, and everyone knew it. And as the sun rose over the desert hills, Elias Boone prepared himself for the showdown that would decide the fate of them all. The morning of the showdown arrived heavy with silence. Dry Creek had never seen such stillness. Not even the usual creak of wagon wheels or the calls of merchants filled the air. It was as though the town itself held its breath, waiting for what everyone knew was coming. Sheriff Maddox had declared it loud and clear. At high noon, Elias Boone would face him in the middle of the main street. No excuses, no delays. One man would walk away, and the rest of the town would learn what fate awaited those who dared to defy Maddox's rule. Elias spent the early hours preparing in quiet. He checked his revolver one last time, sliding the bullets in with steady hands. He tightened the strap on his holster, then adjusted his hat low over his brow. There was no rush in his movements, no sign of fear. He moved like a man who had already accepted whatever the day would bring. Clara sat nearby on the church steps, watching him with worried eyes. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "We can run. I know places in the hills where Maddox's men won't find us." Elias shook his head. "Running won't stop him. He'll keep chasing, keep taking from this town. If I leave now, Dry Creek will stay in chains. Sometimes the only way to stop a man like Maddox is to face him." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to beg him not to risk his life, but deep down she knew he was right. For years she had dreamed someone would stand against Maddox. Now that someone had, she could not let fear steal that moment. She reached for Elias's hand. "Then don't fight for me alone. Fight for all of them." Elias looked at her, and in his eyes she saw no hesitation, only quiet resolve. He gave her hand a small squeeze before rising to his feet. By midday, the townsfolk had gathered along the edges of the street. They lined the wooden sidewalks, peering from behind shutters, pressing against railings, their faces pale with fear but filled with restless anticipation. Children were pulled close to their mothers. Old men leaned on canes, their eyes wide. No one dared speak too loud. At the far end of the street, Maddox appeared. He rode his black horse proudly, his badge gleaming in the harsh sunlight. His men spread out behind him, 6 armed riders who had spent years terrorizing the town. Maddox dismounted slowly, savoring the attention, and stood tall in the center of the street. "Bring him out," Maddox bellowed, his voice booming across the silence. Elias Boone stepped forward from the opposite end, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He moved with steady purpose, each step slow, deliberate. The sun caught the steel of his revolver, but his hand rested calmly at his side. He stopped a good distance from Maddox, his shadow stretching long behind him. The tension was thick. No one breathed. The town seemed to shrink around the 2 men, every board, every nail, every grain of dust waiting for the moment to break. Maddox's grin was cruel. "You've got guts, Boone, I'll give you that. But you don't belong here. This is my town. These people are mine, and when I put you in the ground, they'll remember who owns them." Elias's voice carried strong and even. "A man can own land. He can own cattle. But he can't own people. Not unless they let him. And today that ends." Maddox's eyes narrowed. His hand hovered over his gun. For a long second, neither man moved. The heat pressed down, the silence stretched, and time itself seemed to slow. Then Maddox went for his weapon. His draw was fast, honed from years of practice, but Elias Boone had lived by the quickness of his hand. His revolver cleared the holster in one smooth motion. The crack of the shot echoed like thunder through Dry Creek. Maddox staggered, his gun flying from his grip. He clutched his arm where the bullet had struck, rage flashing across his face. "Get him!" he roared. His men surged forward, pistols raised. But Elias was already moving. He dropped low, firing with calm precision. One by one, Maddox's men faltered, some falling, others retreating under the sharp sting of Elias's bullets that sent dust exploding near their boots. The townsfolk gasped. For years, Maddox's men had been untouchable, their cruelty unchecked. Now they scattered like frightened wolves before a man who refused to bow. Maddox tried to rally them, shouting, but none would stand close. The sight of Elias's steady aim broke their will. Some fled down side streets, others dropped their guns and ran. Within minutes, the proud wall of Maddox's enforcers had crumbled. Elias turned his gaze back to Maddox, who was bleeding but still standing, his chest heaving with fury. "It's over," Elias said quietly. "You've lost." But Maddox snarled, refusing to yield. With a sudden cry, he lunged for the revolver lying in the dirt. The crowd screamed, but Elias was faster. Another shot rang out. Maddox froze, his body trembling, before crashing to the ground. His badge glinted once in the dust before lying still. Silence fell heavy across the street. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then a murmur rippled through the crowd, growing louder, until voices rose in a wave of relief and disbelief. Sheriff Maddox, the man who had ruled through fear for so many years, was finished. Clara pushed through the crowd, her breath catching as she reached Elias. "You did it," she whispered. Her eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of release. For the first time since her family had been taken from her, she felt free. Elias holstered his revolver, his expression calm as ever. He looked around at the people of Dry Creek, their faces wide with awe. "He's gone," Elias said. "But this town doesn't belong to me. It belongs to you. Don't let another man take it again." The words struck deep. The people nodded, some wiping their eyes, others lifting their heads higher than they had in years. For so long they had lived under a shadow. Now with Maddox gone, the sun seemed brighter. In the days that followed, Dry Creek began to change. The jailhouse doors were opened, the saloon filled with laughter that wasn't forced, and neighbors helped each other rebuild what fear had stolen. Maddox's remaining men slipped away, too ashamed or too afraid to stay. The town was finally free. Clara stood at the edge of her burned ranch one evening, staring at the blackened timbers that remained of her family's barn. Elias stood beside her, his hands resting on his belt. "It's gone," she said softly. "Not gone," Elias replied. "Just waiting to be rebuilt." She looked at him, searching his face. "You could ride on now. You've done more than anyone could have asked." "Why stay?" Elias's gaze drifted over the land, the hills stretching into the horizon. "I've been a drifter my whole life," he said. "Never thought I'd find a place worth settling. But maybe that changes now. If you'll have me." Clara's lips trembled into a smile. "I'd like that." And so, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in gold, Elias Boone, once a stranger, once a drifter, became something more. Not just a hero who stood against a tyrant, but a man who found a home, a partner, and a purpose. The people of Dry Creek would tell the story for years, how a young woman, broken but unbent, and a quiet drifter with steady hands had faced down a sheriff who thought he owned the world, how courage had returned to a town long buried under fear, and how one man's choice to stay had saved them all.